And so the shadow wants to be reintegrated. And because it wants to be reintegrated, it will put you in the same situations over and over again in order to get you to reintegrate it. Because you see, in your mind, the shadow is the anti-me. It's like the anti-me. You've got me, and then there's the anti-me. It's because you've rejected it, right? And so Groundhog Day forces Phil to confront the same things over and over and over again, just like the shadow does. And, of course, the groundhog sees its shadow every morning. And the groundhog's name is Phil. Hi, I'm Gabriel from GabrielSeanWallace.com, and this is Identity Coaching with Movies, the podcast where we use movies as coaching tools. I'm an identity coach, which means that I help you to rediscover, reconnect, and recreate your identity from the inside out. And in this podcast, we use movies as the magnificent tools they are for identity coaching. In this episode, we're using the movie Groundhog Day to look at integrating your shadow. All right, welcome to episode number 2 of Identity Coaching with Movies. And we are continuing our work on Groundhog Day from episode 1. I had so much that we just could not get through all of it, so we've made a part 2 instead. And in this part, we are looking at 3 more themes: rituals and Confucius, the 5 stages of grief and loss, and finally integrating your shadow. And that's where it really all comes together. And it's the keystone of all the themes that we've been talking about, really. Now, remember that if you would like to really get something out of it, to really squeeze the juice out of this podcast, then go to my website and pick up the identity worksheet that supplements this podcast. You can get all of the identity worksheets for free instantly if you go to GabrielSeanWallace.com. I'll spell it for you: GabrielSeanWallace.com, and there will be an option for you to access all of the worksheets that I've done so far, which is only 2, but also all of the future identity worksheets. You will get that for free. So, speaking of the worksheet, I hope that if you listened to part 1 of Groundhog Day, that you completed the worksheet from that episode. Okay, this episode, there's a whole new worksheet for you. And if you did complete the worksheet, you should have a clearer picture now of your life purpose. If you're really interested in creating for yourself a life purpose, then there should be something that just rings true, something that feels right in those answers for you. Especially that last question. The last question, if you remember, was if you treated every day as an end in itself rather than a means to an end, how would you live differently? How would you find or create purpose in your life? Now, your answer to that question should indicate to you what would bring your life into alignment with your authentic purpose, which is created by you, right? If you haven't listened to the first episode, definitely go back and listen to episode 1, because then this will all make sense. We went into the myth of Sisyphus and Nietzsche and Camus, right? The existentialists. Now, Phil transcends the cycle of birth and death and rebirth when he acts from an understanding that everything is impermanent, that life shall be reset. But knowing that, he still chooses to be someone of integrity now, to be someone who embodies the values of humanity now. He chooses to give purpose to his own life, rather than passing off purpose to the future, right? Into the hands of of the future. Right? He's turned his nihilism into it's still nihilism, but he's converted his depressive nihilism, right? His nihilism where he rejects life. He's converted it into a nihilism that embraces life, right? Because there are two kinds of nihilism, and we'll get into that later. But there are two kinds of nihilism, and what Phil does is he does a 180-degree turn with the sphere of his own nihilism, you could say. So life for Phil has become a creation of purpose, a creation of meaning, a creation of beauty and duty in the present, regardless of whether or not any of the potential positive consequences actually arise from his actions. When you practice living this way and you discover what fulfills you, regardless of consequences, this is when you have created for yourself life purpose, right? So work on that worksheet. And these worksheets, by the way, you can come back to them and modify your answers. Okay? They're not set in stone. Never betray your own evolution by thinking that, what you write down is something that's never going to change. Not at all. You can always evolve and modify what you have written in the past. That is the beauty of life and the beauty of identity work, is that we're always in evolution, right? All right, so let's get to this next theme: ritual and Confucius. What was really interesting when this movie first came out, for Harold Ramis, he was approached by people from all walks of life. Jews, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, psychoanalysts, and more. They all came up to him and said, "We know that the film was about what we believe." And he found this amusing, but there was a grain of truth in all of them, right? And we talked about a number of them back in episode 1, but let's refer to Judaism for a moment. Before we get into Confucius, let's refer to Judaism. The Torah, and he said that he talked about this actually in an interview. So that is how I came upon this information. The Torah is read every year by rabbis and many people who practice strict Judaism, right? And the way they read it every year is they select the same passages to read on the same days of the year each year. So, for example, it's September 29th. This year, if I read a certain passage on September 29th, next year, September 29th, I'm going to have read the entire book over, right up until that passage again, and I will read that same passage again on September 29th. And so the cycle goes again the next year. It doesn't change, right? The book never changes. But then you might say, well, why read the same thing over and over every year when it doesn't change? The thing is, people change. And because people change, the context of the passages in their lives are different. The meaning takes on a new meaning. Have you ever read a book? Maybe you read a book 10 years ago, and then you read a book this year. You read that same book this year again, right? I would bet you, as long as you're a person who embraces change and evolution, which I think you are if you're listening to this, then you will have noticed different things in the book. In fact, even if you're not someone who is, entrenched in personal development, it will mean something differently to you now after 10 long years of life. You will notice different things because you are different, and it will mean something different to you because you are looking at it with different eyes, through a different context. And so, this is similar with the Torah every year, and similar to the experience that Phil is having on Groundhog Day, right? He is going around in this cycle just like people read the Torah in a cycle. And Phil is changing, but his environment is not. And so Phil starts to question his own habitual behaviors to life, just as people do who read the Torah over and over and over again. They read it over and over again because there is a sort of reminder in the act of doing that breaks their bad habits and solidifies new habits, strengthens how they want to live their life. So my question for you related to this ritual is, firstly, what habits in your life are holding you back? And what habits in your life would you like to remove or change? Okay, it's really one question. So what habits in your life are holding you back that you would like to remove or change? Now, we talked last time about how there was no holy man in the movie, but there is a very spiritual experience that Phil is going through. It's really, I've got another analogy here that might ring true for you. It's kind of like a self-regulating spin cycle that he's in. Like an existential, metaphysical washing machine, right? And he's being cleansed of his pernicious way of life. His soul is being washed clean through the unrelenting grip of these time cycles. He sheds his bitterness, his cynicism, his self-destructiveness. Just as if he were going round and round and round in a washing machine, he becomes cleansed of his old ways. The power of ritual can do this for you. This is why people the rabbis basically read the Torah as they do every year. And now moving on to Confucius. Confucius's Analects is all about the minute details that structure life. Everything about how Confucius behaved. And reading it, it can seem pedantic, but there is a purpose for it, and there is a power in it. You see, it's the routines that compose most of our lives, right? Most of what you do in the world, in your life, is routine. And there's a wonderful little book called The Path by Michael Puett and Christine Groslow. I believe that's how you say her name. I may be pronouncing it wrong. Look up The Path and you'll see. And I highly recommend you check this book out. It's all about applying classical Chinese philosophy to modern day life. And it's a wonderful little book. It's not a big book. It's a little book. Each chapter focuses on one of 5 Chinese philosophers. And chapter 3 breaks down the philosophy of Confucius. And you just got to read it. It's very insightful. It talks about how most of our lives are spent responding to the world in some way. And it's true. We respond emotionally because we're humans. And that's okay. It's okay to respond emotionally. We wouldn't be human if we didn't do that. Now, we can learn how to cultivate our own responses. And the best way to do that is through ritual. We can change our unconscious emotional responses. Did you realize that? We can do that, and if you think of all the rituals you have in your life and how they affect you, you would be shocked at how much they actually do affect you emotionally. We can train ourselves to respond in certain ways to certain circumstances through developing our own rituals in life. And we can do it consciously rather than living in an unconscious ritualistic state, ritualistic cycle. Rather than unconsciously responding and becoming angry when something happens, we can use the power of ritual to change it so that we respond with wisdom, respond with love, with compassion, or whatever you want, with energy. So in the movie, Phil questions the rituals he's been living his life by and throws them into chaos, right? Early on in the movie. He has to confront the power of rituals because everything keeps happening over and over and over again in the same way. And so he has to work with this, and he has to become ritualistic in a sense. And it's hard for him at first. And so, because of a variety of reasons, which we'll get into very soon in the stages of grief and loss, he throws his life rituals into chaos. He refuses to do his job. He doesn't even get dressed sometimes, right? He completely rejects rituals, and that can be okay, because what that does is he's questioning the rituals he has been living by. You see, he's questioning whether they were serving him. Were those rituals serving him? He has to really question that. And so that turns into chaos. But then he emerges out from the chaos by developing more mindful rituals. He learns how to be conscious of his daily rituals. And so he does. And this is how we do change our rituals. We do go through a period of chaos. You try to break a habit and change into a new one, there's going to be a period of chaos there. And if you think chaos is a strong word, well, there are different degrees of chaos that you can have, but it depends on how long you've had that ritual for. And chaos, maybe you're reacting well to chaos in some aspects of ritual change. So my next question for you is, what habits in your life could you build in order to influence your emotional responses to life? Let me give you a quick example. So some people, when they sit down to eat a meal, they will just basically put the food in their mouths, stuff their faces, and not even think about it, right? And then what happens is that because they're just after that perhaps chemical rush of feeling when they eat, they will reject certain foods that they don't like. And perhaps it will lead them onto a road of being unhealthy, right? Because they're not appreciating any of the food. They're not appreciating the fact that they have food. And so when they have a meal that is less than desirable for them, they will start to feel upset. They will have an emotional reaction to having food that they don't like. Well, what if that same person started to say a little prayer, just before they eat? Now, maybe that person doesn't even believe in God, right? In any divine being. That's still okay. Just develop the ritual. Just do it for fun, right? If that person just did it as if they were really praying, like a game. Now, this is also from this chapter in The Path. He talks about Confucius's as-if rituals. So if the person were to just say a little prayer, even though it didn't really mean anything to them, what they would most likely find is that they would develop a sense of gratitude for the food just before eating it, every time, no matter what they were eating. And so even when they receive a meal that was less desirable for them, then they will still feel grateful. If they just do that little prayer, it will put them into another emotional state. And you know what? That's a ritual. They've developed a ritual that will put them into another state and control their emotional responses a little bit better. Now, you can do this in so many ways. That's just a tiny little example. So again, the question is, what habits in your life could you build in order to influence your emotional responses to life? And that's on the worksheet too. And just before we wrap up this little section, this theme, it reminded me of a quote that is probably misattributed to Confucius because I've read most, if not all, of the Confucian canon, and I do not remember ever reading this quote directly, but I've seen it online attributed to Confucius. But I love the quote, so I'm going to use it anyway. It is, "We have two lives, and the second begins when we realize we only have one." Very powerful quote, because there's a lot of truth to that, regardless of who said it. There's a lot of truth to that quote, because a person can act recklessly when they see themselves as immortal, when they see themselves as, when they haven't come face to face with death at all. But a person reaches a kind of turning point and is born anew when something happens to make them realize that they only have one life to live. And it's happened to me, and it can happen to you too. So, speaking of that, let's move on to theme 4, the stages of grief and loss. It's a nice segue because Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book in 1969 called On Death and Dying. And it was about the stages of grief that terminally ill patients can go through. I should say that later she said she regretted that it had been misinterpreted as a universal step-by-step process, and that she intended for it to mean that there were different stages which some people may experience differently from others. Okay. But the general stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And remember, these are stages for terminally ill people. And Phil, really, if you think about it, he's got one day left to live. You might say, yes, he lives forever. But in another perspective, he only has one more day. He has one day left to live. He will never see, well, okay, he does eventually, but as far as he knows, he will only ever see February 2nd forever. He will never see beyond that day, and so he only has that day left. So in a sense, he's terminally ill, right? But in this movie, I would probably substitute the stage of anger with panic. Because, he's already kind of angry all the time. He's this ornery misanthrope. And I would also add reckless abandonment after the stage of panic as well. So let's go through some of the stages with him. on day two, we have denial, right? Day two is, in other words, the first day that he experiences this loop, this time ditch. And I think at one point he even says, this can't be happening, or this isn't happening, something to that effect. So day two is denial. It goes by fairly quickly. And then he enters panic on day three. He starts to panic. He doesn't know what to do. And he goes to the doctor, right? He goes to the psychiatrist. And at the end of his day of panic, he gets drunk at the bowling alley and goes into a stage that I would call reckless abandonment. He has abandoned any sense of responsibility for life at this point. There has been a dissolution of consequence. He drives on the railroad tracks. He finds himself in prison. And then he's elated when he wakes up back in bed on day 4. And then he takes joy in other people's misfortune, right? He doesn't warn them about the weather. He lets them just go and face the blizzard. He lets someone else step into that puddle, right? And he doesn't warn them. He sees no consequences for anything. He eats like a pig, right? And the thing is, it really points to how he's lived his life internally up to this point. He has lived his life by following rules because he had to. Because of consequences. He even talks about this in the car, now that I'm thinking about it. He even says he's sick of following their rules. I'm not going to live by their rules anymore, right? So he's been living by doing things he didn't want to do, being someone he didn't want to be. And because now he's freed of those consequences, he feels liberated to act from ego. Rita has said, I know you're egocentric. It's your defining characteristic. And so he's operating from this sense of rebellion, of an escaped prisoner now, an egocentric prisoner. So then what does he do? He goes and he manipulates people, and he manipulates his world in any way he can. He manipulates Nancy to have sex with him. He steals money because he can, and he can get away with it, which shows that he is someone who wasn't following the rules because they were good in themselves, but he was following the rules because of consequences before, right? And he's developed a kind of insouciance. There is a careless indifference about all of his actions now. But we know that he's actually interested in Rita. So pretty soon he attempts to manipulate Rita for selfish gains, for egocentric reasons, right? And he realizes that he can't. And this becomes yet another prison for him. And so this stage actually said, as he's navigating his world, he has already started to enter the stage of bargaining, right? So after this initial stage of reckless abandonment, when he starts to manipulate Rita, he is entering the stage of bargaining. And this is interesting because bargaining is actually a stage of, if only I had done something. If only I'd done this, then everything would be okay. And it's an emotional stage of regret and what if I had done this, right? And what's interesting about that for Phil is that Phil actually can go back and change things. So what he does is, in a sort of virtual reality simulation sense, he goes back and he modifies his actions and his words based on what he now knows he should have done in the first place. So it's an interesting reversal of this stage in the movie, actually. But still, however much he tries to bargain, he realizes that he cannot bargain with Rita's rejection of him romantically, right? And so he sees the limits of his universe and he falls into a sense of despair. And so this is when he enters the fourth stage, which is depression. And we can sense this first when he says, it's going to be cold, it's going to be gray, and it's going to last you the rest of your life. This is how someone in depression sees the world. That's exactly how they see the world. Cold, gray, and it's going to last forever. And so we know he's in depression now. And then he starts this chain of suicides, right? He drives himself off a cliff. He jumps in front of a van, he puts a toaster in the bathtub, and he jumps from the church. So, after Phil has killed himself so many times, what happens is he crosses the Rubicon. He passes what I would call a barrier, a breaking point. And I want to take 1 minute to talk about what I mean with this. I do a practice called shamanic breathing. I highly recommend it. It's incredible. And there's a certain point, I guess you would say around 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, depending on who you are. If you do the shamanic breathing properly, it's very intense. Okay, it's a very intense process, and at first it's a struggle for your body to breathe in this way, so rhythmically and forcefully and intensely. But there's a point around the 15 to 20 minute mark, I would say, where you cross a barrier. And it's not just physical, it's not just getting challenging physically at that point, it's also getting challenging mentally, psychologically, because you start to think, oh, maybe I should just not bother, I've done enough now. I'm going to stop, or I'm going to slow down, or I've done enough. But then you get to like a peak, and this is where the barrier is. And you might say it's a peak, and once you get up it, it's easy to go downhill from then. You cross some kind of threshold. And it's the same in meditation. It's the same for addicts, right? Who are trying to recover from addiction. It's different. The period of time is different for everyone and different for whatever addiction you have, but there's a threshold where suddenly the struggle becomes a little bit easier. And it's the same with trying to develop new good habits. They talk about, after 21 days, you've crossed the threshold. Sometimes it's 30 days. Sometimes it's 90 days. The truth is, it's different for everyone. There's no certain number it must be. It depends on who you are and what habit it is you're talking about. And it's also the same with grief. Someone who is experiencing grief, most people will tell you that they cross a threshold at some point when it's always going to be a challenge, but the emotional response that you have suddenly becomes a little bit easier once you pass a certain threshold. And so in the movie, this is what Phil crosses. He's killed himself so many times that he just crosses that threshold. And that is when his nihilism turns on its head. Right? As I said before, there are two kinds of nihilism. There's the nihilism that rejects life because it's meaningless, and there is a nihilism that embraces life because there's no external meaning, and so you create the meaning. When you look at life that way, there's no external meaning, but that means that I create all the meaning. When you can really feel that deep down through your bones and into your heart, into the eye of the storm of life, that is when you cross the Rubicon. So he crosses that threshold, and now he changes. He changes from the inside. His character becomes one of generosity, one of exploration. He's exploring now not for selfish gains, but for self-improvement. He has realized that it makes him feel positive to become better. Not just to act better, not just to follow the rules, but to become better. And so he starts learning. He learns how to play the piano, how to ice sculpt. He takes different approaches to his interactions with people, with Ned, with Larry, with the old man. So let me ask you this, and this is on your worksheet. What would you take the time to learn if you had forever to do it? You can write as many things down as you want. Brainstorm, baby. What would you take the time to learn if you had forever to do it? And this can also help you with creating your life purpose. Your answers to this question may be revealing enough to you that you get some new ideas about life purpose, authentic life purpose. He also starts going on errands, right? He saves a boy falling from a tree. He changes someone's tire. He saves someone from choking to death. He convinces, I guess is the word, a bride to go through with the wedding. He fixes someone's back. He invests in Ned's insurance. He finally invests in his own life. And so people invest in him. When the time comes for him to stand on stage and for other people to buy him, right? People invest in him. So before I get more into that, the next question is, what responsibilities could you give yourself today to make your life more fulfilling? Because this fulfillment comes in the responsibilities that Phil has given himself. Correct? No one is telling him he has to go do these things, but he does these things because this gives his life purpose. He has lived a day of responsibility despite the fact that there will be no consequences. He has learned not to live by doing things, but rather by being someone. And his happiness ripples out from who he has become. And he ends up saying things like, no matter what happens tomorrow or for the rest of my life, I'm happy now because I'm right here. Today is tomorrow. It's so beautiful. These are all things that he says. Let's live here. And so he has reached the final stage, right? If you haven't figured that out yet, he's reached the final stage, which is acceptance. People these days want to escape the now. Well, Groundhog Day forces Phil to live in the now. He learns how to be and live in the present moment. He is then released from the cycle of suffering, the cycle of samsara. Don't miss today. You know, have you heard the Latin expression memento mori? It means be mindful of death. Remember that Phil is, as far as he knows, terminally ill. And if you go back to your first worksheet from the first podcast, there's a question, what would you do if you only had one day to live, right? Well, Phil is in that unique situation where he only has one day to live, yet he lives forever at the same time. So Phil has created purpose out of a life only having one day left. And there's a great quote by Seneca, the Greek Stoic. Balance life's books each day. The one who puts the finishing touches on their life each day is never short of time. End quote. And that's exactly what Phil does in his last day. He's got one day left to make a difference, and he makes a difference in everyone's lives, right? It's very apparent by the end of the movie. So, you know what's coming. The question is, how can you put the finishing touches on your life today? You know, another word for acceptance is reintegration. As far as these stages go, reintegration. And that brings us to the integration of your shadow. So theme 5, finally, integrating the shadow. What is the shadow? Well, Carl Jung wrote about it extensively. His book, in particular, Archetypes of the Unconscious, talked about this. One way to look at it is that it is the Siberia of your consciousness. It's that part of you where you dump all of the characteristics that your ego has rejected. It's that part it's that wild land that you don't go to consciously. You don't want to think about. It's just way out there in the wilderness. And the thing is, it's not just negative traits. A lot of people just assume the shadow is everything. It's dark, so that means it's everything negative. No, not necessarily. The shadow is actually the seed of creativity. And in my creativity coaching, which I do, I also have people do a little bit of shadow work because this helps. So your shadow is still a part of you. And by rejecting parts of yourself, you create more darkness in your life. See, the reason it's dark isn't because the characteristics that you have rejected were dark in the first place. No. It's dark because it is something you've rejected. And so the shadow wants to be reintegrated. And because it wants to be reintegrated, it will put you in the same situations over and over again in order to get you to reintegrate it. Because you see, in your mind, the shadow is the anti-me. It's like the anti-me. You've got me, and then there's the anti-me. It's because you've rejected it, right? And so Groundhog Day forces Phil to confront the same things over and over and over again, just like the shadow does. And, of course, the groundhog sees its shadow every morning. And the groundhog's name is Phil. And so this shows you that Phil is rejecting a part of himself, right? They're both Phil. Have you ever wondered why they decided to make Phil have the same name as the groundhog? This is the reason. The groundhog is synonymous with shadow. The groundhog lives under the ground, under the surface. And the groundhog is also trapped. Just look at that little aperture in the tree trunk that they pull him out of, right? Phil is like a trapped animal. Phil, the weatherman, is a trapped animal in this time ditch, just like the groundhog Phil is trapped in his little tree trunk. And remember, in the diner, even the one of those slovenly guys says, "Phil, like the groundhog, Phil?" And then, of course, he says, "Yeah, like the groundhog, Phil," with a sardonic little smile, right? And so, why is Phil there in Punxsutawney? Phil is going there to confront his shadow. And he's been there before, right? It's his fourth year in a row. He keeps going there to confront his shadow, and he detests it. And at the very beginning of the movie, at the very beginning, when they show him in the studio, I just want to recommend first, there's a YouTube video that I watched that has hardly any views at all, but it's very insightful on this subject, on the subject of color symbolism in Groundhog Day. And if you just type into YouTube something like Groundhog Day red, blue, green, or blue, green, red, or something like that, I recommend that video. It's about 20 minutes long, and it gives some great insights as far as the color symbolism there. I think one thing that I would add to that is that the color blue actually symbolizes Phil's shadow. And it starts out, right, the movie starts out with the changing clouds and the weather. And that's just telling in itself, right? Because, Jim Carrey has recently said something like, I've come to realize that my emotion is just the weather, right? And that's a great way to look at it. And it's because the weather is not something we control, but rather the environment which we have to adapt to. And so we see Phil in front of this blue screen, and he puts his hand out and says something like, this is exactly where I would want to be, or this is where I want to be. And it shows him, it's telling us he wants to be in the blue. And the thing is, here, you see at the same shot, you see his shadow. The shadow of his hand is there. So it's telling you that blue and shadow are merging here. Shadow merges with the blue. So everything that we see that is blue from here on in the movie is representative somehow of his shadow that he wishes to integrate with. He's putting on a veneer in this studio. It's not who he is, right? He's saying he wants to be in the blue. He wants to be integrated with his shadow. And then Rita comes and steps into the blue and even becomes the blue that he wants to be in. So he wants to merge with Rita, and I would suggest that Rita is actually not necessarily his shadow, but his anima, which is also another archetype of Jungian psychology. But anyway, I just recommend that video. And he's joking on day one of Groundhog Day. He's joking and reporting with some measure of enthusiasm just before the groundhog sees his shadow. But then, as soon as they announce the groundhog sees a shadow, immediately he returns right back to his cynical self right afterwards. It was almost like he was hopeful that the groundhog wasn't going to see his shadow. He was in a jokey mood. But then when the groundhog saw his shadow, he reacted in such a way that even Rita said something like, okay, now let's do it without the sarcasm. Right? And so it's quite obvious that he is not indifferent to what the fact that the groundhog has seen a shadow. He wanted the groundhog to not see a shadow because he does not want to confront his shadow again. And so when Groundhog Day comes upon him again the following day, he doesn't want to deal with the shadow again. He does the first part of the reporting, but then just as they're about to announce that the groundhog sees a shadow, he walks away. And this is exactly what we all do. We run away from our shadows. We run away because we're afraid. You see, you're afraid to be the thing that you judge, right? And so you repress your own evolution. Do you remember on February 1st, before he even enters Groundhog Day at all, he says something like, "I've seen Larry eat." And then he puts his hand in his mouth to imitate Larry eating, right? But what does he do then? A few days later, on Groundhog Day, he stuffs some piece of food into his mouth in the exact same way. So he was repressing that part of himself before, you see. But now he's felt liberated to act in however a way he wants, right? And so he is released from the burden of avoiding his shadow, but he makes the mistake, of course, of just running with it. And you can see how much of a burden it is. He's at one point even says, "I don't even like myself." He's been running from himself, from parts of himself. He's been trying to project the parts of himself that he doesn't like onto other people, right? By accusing Larry of eating in the way that he would eat if no one were watching him. See, when we practice non-judgment, though, and unconditional acceptance of others and reality and yourself, then this makes it easier on yourself to embrace your shadow, the aspects of yourself that you have rejected. The only reason all this shadow work is difficult is because we have spent so long projecting those parts of ourselves onto others and judging and rejecting them. So, what do? Well, what you don't do is simply express everything that's in your shadow like Phil starts to do. You don't just start to eat like a pig, and you don't just start to treat people like dirt, because that's what you've rejected as part of your personality, right? You do not have to act in a way that your shadow demands. You just have to accept your shadow for what it is. Love it, because that is loving you. This is self-acceptance. And there are many ways to practice doing this. One way is artistic creation. By expressing those parts of your shadow that you can't act out everything in your shadow, right? But you can put it into art. So the initial pain, which was the reason why we condemned something to our shadow in the first place, will come up in shadow work. When we start to accept and embrace and communicate with these aspects of ourselves in our shadow. This is why it's so difficult to confront your shadow. That initial pain will come up again, up to the surface, just like the groundhog is pulled from under the ground up above the surface. And, dealing with the shadow, it's better than not dealing with the shadow, because what you're essentially doing is you're creating a polarization of yourself. And what inevitably happens with a lot of people is this painful oscillation between rejection of the shadow and plunging into the shadow. You don't want that. We talked last time a little bit about how the blizzard comes from his heart. And it does. Only he's denying that it's there at all, right? He's convinced himself there won't be a blizzard because it's the last thing he wants to deal with. So what he does is he convinces himself, he deceives himself originally into thinking that there will be no blizzard, even though everyone else is saying there's going to be a blizzard. He's saying there won't be because he doesn't want to deal with it. But the way he's living his life, there's a blizzard a-coming. Right? The blizzard in his life. You can see that. You can pay attention to that when the policeman at one point says, "You got that moisture on your head, pal." Right? By the end, this reality has been entirely recontextualized through his eyes. Right? When he wakes up February 3rd, he eventually looks out over all the snow and says, "It's so beautiful." Because what he's done is he's altered the context. He's altered the meaning of that snow. He's altered the meaning of the blizzard. He's embraced the blizzard into his soul. So this whole experience, you could look at it as kind of a prescription from God for a healing of deep resentfulness and for an integration of a runaway shadow, right? He's gone through this whole process as a healing process, just like we talked about the washing machine, spun him round and round and round and round again. What's happened is he's learned how to integrate his shadow through this whole process. He started off with a kind of masked petulance in the way he was living. I mean, after all, society is structured in such a way that we need an assortment of personas in order to socialize. We need a whole closet of costumes in order to function in society. But that means that what happens is we reject or we suppress certain aspects of ourselves. And he was doing that a lot. So what I would like to ask you is, what aspect of yourself are you suppressing into your shadow? Now, when he starts to integrate some of this stuff into his from his shadow into himself, and you can see that through the color symbolism, which I think is very interesting too, with the color blue, right? He starts to wear a little bit more blue. He eats blueberry waffles. He eventually, as I was saying, it's so painful for him to start dealing with this, to start confronting this blueness, to start confronting this shadow. Is so painful for him that he comes to the conclusion in this quote, "There's no way that this winter is ever going to end, not as long as this groundhog keeps seeing his shadow. I don't see any other way out of this." Right? That's what he says. And so what happens is he lets the shadow do the driving, right? He puts the shadow at the wheel and he tries to kill the shadow. But the thing is, in doing so, he is also killing his whole self. You can't just kill a shadow without killing yourself. So he's killing himself and the shadow at once by driving off the cliff. So it's very important, I think, before that, though, that he shows that he's put the shadow at the wheel. And when the shadow is at the wheel and you just let the shadow do the driving of your life, that shadow can take you right off a cliff. If you let it drive long enough, that's what'll happen. So the solution is not to just give the shadow control of your life, okay? So I would like to ask you this. Where are you letting your shadow do the driving? Okay. Eventually, once he passes this barrier that I was talking about, he starts wearing more blue and looking cheerful, right? This is what he wants. And on that final day, he makes a speech on TV that shows that he has fully integrated the shadow. He's accepted it. He has embraced the shadow. And at the end of the day, what's he doing? He's playing the blues on the piano. He's playing the blues. He has integrated the blue, integrated his shadow into his life, and he's dancing with it. He's dancing with it. That's what you got to do. You don't reject it, and you don't let it do the driving either. You have to create art with it. You have to play the blues. Right? So, do what Jung says in his prime alchemical dictum. He says, solve a coagula. Dissolve and integrate. That's exactly what Phil does. He dissolves himself, everything goes into chaos, and then he integrates everything, including the parts he previously rejected, his shadow. Now, why I've left the shadow integration until the end is very simple. You can create your own life purpose, right? We've been through that. You can accept all the circumstances of your life and achieve peace, inner peace. But if you try to do it without integrating your shadow, it's all self-deception. Believe me, you are creating from a fragmented persona rather than from a holistic sense of self, an integrated self. Then you can align your creation with authenticity, align your creation with truth. Your shadow is a part of your identity. It's the parts of yourself that you have laid aside. How can you create an authentic life purpose without it? How can you accept the world as it is when you haven't accepted all of yourself? This is the work. This is the identity work that has to be done continuously. And it's never complete. It's never complete because we are never complete so long as we are still alive. So my question for you, my final question, is how could you integrate the parts of your shadow in a healthy way? How could you integrate any part of your shadow in a healthy way? Phil transcends the cycle when he integrates his shadow and accepts his life. He invests into his life fully. And so life invests in him. Rita invests in him financially, right? When she buys him on stage. And the universe invests in him by allowing him to transcend the time ditch. Spend your day living in the everlasting moment. Breathe in the day. Build something with your day. Spend your day loving. Spend your day learning. Develop rituals that strengthen your mind, your body, your spirit, your family, your community, your world. Integrate your shadow. Because that will make you whole, my friend. So, I do recommend going to the website and getting the worksheets for yourself. There's a little extra there, but for now, your final takeaway assignment questions, I'll just give you real quickly 3 of them. What parts of yourself have you been rejecting? What would you take the time to learn if you had forever to do it? And finally, the last question that I didn't mention, what responsibilities could you give yourself today to make your life more fulfilling? Please, if you enjoyed this podcast, subscribe wherever you're listening to it. Leave a positive review wherever you're listening to it. It really does help the podcast grow, and it will help me reach many people who can definitely benefit from this. I might even read your review out on the show. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, Gabriel Sean Wallace. Check out the website, of course, GabrielSeanWallace.com. If you're interested in getting coaching from me, one-to-one identity coaching or creativity coaching, where you would get a completely personalized service and my full attention for 3 months of one-to-one coaching sessions via Skype, Zoom, or WeChat. You can find out more about that on my website too, or recommend me to someone who you think might need it. Hope you enjoyed this. Have a great day wherever and whenever and whoever you are, and keep growing into you.